In today's video I'm going to be painting the most requested Infinity faction on the channel because it seems a lot of you Infinity fans like Morats a lot. So therefore I'm going to be painting Kornak Gazarot, the Morat character, into the official color scheme, which will allow me to paint some really vibrant reds and greens as well. And the official color scheme for this character and the Morats in general is quite interesting because it has a lot of reds in it, not just for the armor panels or the clothes, but also for the skin tones. So my challenge with this model is going to be to use reds all over the place, but make them distinct enough that all of those elements are still easily distinguishable as different things. Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Phalanx Miniatures. For the coat, first I added a bit of black to the red and base coated almost everything with it. I only left a little black in the very deepest recesses. Once I achieved the full coverage, I switched to pure red and started half layering, half glazing towards the raised areas of the coat. Initially I used a thicker layer consistency to cover most of the surface, but later I thinned it more to a more glaze-like consistency. I applied multiple layers, but the later ones I only applied on a smaller surface closer and closer to the raised areas of the coat. I wanted the coat to be slightly warmer than the armor panels to differentiate them, so I lightened up the red with cold yellow. And yes, I know it says cold and we are going for warmth, but believe me, it is warmer than using white. I used this only on the raised parts. Inside the surface we fully covered with the previous pure red, but making sure that I cover even less surface, leaving some of the previous color behind. At some point in the process I also realized that I wanted more shadow areas to increase the contrast, so I thinned down some violet from Chimera Colors and glazed it into the shadows. Violet makes for more interesting shadows than just pure black. I wanted the coat to be smooth, but I also wanted a tiny bit of variation in there, so occasionally I added a couple of scratches here and there. This also helps break up the transitions a bit. I also wanted the robes to be relatively smooth compared to the armor, so in between colors I also used glazes of the previous color to smoothen the transition. If you want an even smoother result, you can apply lots of very thin glazes. For the final highlight, I added sun ray into the red. This has more white than the cold yellow, so I used this more sparingly, only on a really small surface inside the previous highlight on the very top of the raised elements. If you don't have this color, you can simply use ice yellow from AK Interactive, by the way. With that, I was pretty happy with the coat and I was ready to move on to the armor panels. I used the same colors here as before with a couple of differences. First, I mixed in more sunray into the red than cold yellow, thereby making it slightly more pinkish instead of orangish. The second is that I applied a lot more obvious scratches along the edges with the lighter highlights. Not sure how obvious it is on the footage, but in real life the two reds are noticeably different. After finishing the red parts of both the coat and the armor, the only red thing remaining was the face, but I'll get back to that a bit later, so let's move on to the green parts of the coat. Similarly to the reds, I wanted these to be very saturated, so I used Chimera Colors once again, this time phthalo green, or however you pronounce that. This is quite translucent in my experience and doesn't cover black very well, but I used that to my advantage. I simply layered it towards the raised areas, and because of its translucency, it created a pretty nice transition over the black. Once I got as much as I could out of the coverage, I started adding cold yellow again. This increases the coverage quite dramatically, so from this point on I used a more diluted consistency and glazed in the transition between the darker and the brighter areas with pure green where I felt the transition is a bit too obvious. Finally, I started adding sun ray to the mix, and I used it only on the most raised areas where I wanted the light to appear the strongest. And with that, the coat was mostly done and it was time to finish the armor as well. The main color I used for this was Russian green from AK Interactive, because I wanted these elements to be more muted than the reds and the emerald greens before. I wanted the model to be super saturated and contrasty overall, but you can't have everything saturated and contrasty all over the model. Sometimes the lack of contrast on one element contrasts with the very contrasty elements around it, if that makes any sense. Process-wise, I essentially repeated what I did on the red armor panels, but this time I used the Russian green instead of the red as my base color. Then I added cold yellow first. And finally got the brightest highlights by adding sun ray. Just like before with the red panels, I also added some scratches everywhere. At this point the model looks a little bit too red and green, so it was time to put some more color on it, so let's paint some yellow thingies. Painting yellow is always tricky since the coverage is usually about as good as spreading cold butter over a cold piece of toast, so I use some tricks to achieve a nice saturated warm yellow. First, I use the same red and black combo that I already had on my palette to cover everything. Then I used orange from Chimera to paint basically all over that, leaving only a tiny bit of red in the shadows. Then I moved on to warm yellow and covered around 80% of the orange again. Finally, I edge highlighted a bit with cold yellow, but not too much to keep everything nice, saturated and warm. Aside from the smaller elements and effects, the only big color that was still missing at this point was the black, so let's do that. For this, I decided to cheat a bit and use the same paints, but go for more highlights and brightness for the things I wanted to be metallic. This process comes down to mostly just edge highlighting. I started with a dark grey from AK Interactive and went quite heavy on the edge highlights everywhere. Then I switched to graphite from AK and went for thinner edge highlights, concentrating on the outwards facing edges. For the black elements I mostly left it at this stage, not adding more highlights, but for the metals I went up one more highlight using medium grey from AK quite sparingly, only on the most prominent edges. You might have noticed that I concentrated most of my efforts on the biggest colors around the model, but I left most of the face, the hair and the beard completely unpainted so far. But now with the rest of the model mostly done, it was time to tackle that beautiful smiling face and the glorious beard as well. For the beard and the hair I used Middlestone from AK as the base color. My idea was that I would simply overbrush this on the braids and be done with it. But as usual, when I want to take shortcuts, I end up working more. I covered too much of the intricate details and the whole thing looked like a mess. Not a big problem though, I simply turned to my trusty contrast paint Agaros Dunes, which I watered down very slightly and applied it all over like a wash. This brought out the details again and brought back the saturation as well. Once it dried, I used a mix of Middlestone and Sunray to highlight it, but this time actually paying attention to what I was hitting. Finally, I switched to pure Sunray and highlighted some of the details, especially on the raised parts of the hair and the beard where the light would hit them more. And with that I came to the moment that I dreaded the most about this project, which is to paint his face, which is extremely ugly but also extremely tiny. So I advise you to do what I did and use a pair of magnifying glasses. And as usual, when I paint faces, I went in with a plan which immediately went to pieces as soon as I started painting, and then I started improvising. Instead of the usual red, I switched to brick red from AK to create a different tone from the armor and the coat. I covered the whole face with this, only leaving some darker areas in the deepest crevices. Then I started adding Sunray to the mix, using it to highlight the most important elements of the face, like the forehead, the cheeks, the nose. I can't really say that I like the end result too much at this stage, so I made a very thin magenta wash to bring back the color a bit. This I liked even less because it was absolutely not the color I was going for. The solution was to go back to the original Chimera color. I created a thin wash from this and applied it all over like I did the magenta before. And that did the trick. I just needed to bring back the highlights that the washes destroyed, and I called it good enough. The only big element remaining on the model that was unpainted was the sword. Well, I kind of painted it a little bit because I used the same green that I used for the coat on the blade, and then I also painted some parts of it with black and kind of metallic elements, but I wanted to do something special for it as well. So I took some pure white and I used it to edge highlight the green blade. Once done, I used green fluorescent paints to paint all over the sword, but especially the white edge highlights. This gave a greenish tint to the whole sword and made the edges glow green. Finally, we really come to the end, and the only thing remaining was painting the base. First, I covered the whole base in Chimera colors violet. Then I dry brushed AK blue-green over it. I didn't really like the end result, but when in doubt, turn to contrast, so I used Aethermatic blue all over the base, and that was exactly what I was looking for. And with that, the model was done, and the end result looks like this. Thank you so much for watching the video, and if you have any factions or specific models that you want me to paint, please let me know in the comments below. And of course, as usual, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.